Hello and welcome to the first episode of a new series from Garsington Opera at Home, Music for the Eyes. I'm really excited to be bringing you this with a great friend and collaborator of mine, Dr. Imogen Tedbury. Hi, Imi.
Hi, Johnny. Hi. I'm thrilled to be having this conversation with you. I know many of us are really missing our museums and opera houses at the moment, the kinds of places we'd usually go to have conversations with old friends. So it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's brilliant, and we thought for this first episode we would focus on Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro, not least because it's possibly the greatest masterpiece ever, but also it provides a really interesting scene for us to explore as it displays this incredible point in social history, the emergence of the bourgeoisie.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can see this trend really running throughout the 18th century across the arts. You think about 18th century literature, the rise of the novel, and also we can see this in so many paintings from the time as well. And I'm excited to share a couple of these with you in a bit.
So for the next 30 minutes, we'll have a chat with some really brilliant artists and experts. Grab a drink, anything you need to get comfortable. And shall we start maybe by looking at a clip from Garsington Opera's recent production of The Marriage of Figaro. This is where Figaro and Susanna on their wedding day are preparing their rooms.
Sei 43. Ora sì che io son contento, sembra fatto in per me, sembra fatto in per me. 5. Guarda un po' mio caro Figaro, 10. Guarda un po' mio caro Figaro, 20. Guarda un po', 30. Guarda adesso il mio cappello. 36. Guarda adesso il mio cappello. 43. Guarda un po' mio caro Figaro, guarda adesso il mio cappello, il mio cappello, il mio cappello. Sì, il mio cuore ora è più bello, sembra fatto in verde.
So it's exciting because we have two of the people that brought that production to the stage. And before we meet them, if you haven't already seen the production in full, you can head over to our YouTube channel to watch the whole thing. So it now gives me huge pleasure to welcome Dougie Boyd, conductor of that production and also artistic director of Garsington Opera, and John Cox, director of that production. Dougie, hello.
Lovely to be here, and it brings back so many wonderful memories.
And hello, John.
Hello to you all.
Dougie, I wanted to ask you, when you watch this piece, it's clear, at least to me, that it's a miracle of dramatic pacing. I wondered, is it the same musically as well? How does Mozart do that?
Well, it's a miracle on so many levels, but for sure, the momentum is at the heart of these great operas by Mozart. And in fact, I think it starts from the very, very first bar that precedes what we've just watched and listened to, which is the overture. And the overture is not just something where people can get ready to sit down ready for the main event, but it paints a picture through music about the events which are about to unfold. And it does in a way that describes this crazy day, this one crazy day from the first moment, from this hushed pianissimo, but seething with life, seething with energy. And although it doesn't have any themes from the rest of the opera that follows, we do get the sense, for example, of wedding bells in the first 40, and this energy, this incredible energy. And when we get to the end of the overture, we go straight into the duet that we've just seen. So the momentum continues, and we're immediately into the scene where Figaro is measuring the bed for their wedding night, and we're off.
And you were saying the other day that, you know, sometimes people think tempo is the same as pulse. And just tell us a little bit about that.
I think if I can make the analogy with popular music culture, which I'm not against, but in general, popular music culture has something mechanical in it. We have a, chicka, chicka. There's something that's absolutely mechanical in general, in its metronomic pulse. And of course, we have rhythm. Rhythm is unbelievably important in our music. But one of the things that differentiates what we do is that, as well as rhythm, it follows the tempo of our bodies. You know, our blood races faster, our hearts go faster. And this is the difference, in my opinion, between simple metronome and pulse. And Mozart is full of this. The pulse never stops, but the breathing is agitated, the breathing relaxes. And I go back to this analogy about a wheel turning. The wheel never stops. Actually, sometimes the wheel with tension rewinds, but then it takes up the momentum again. And in this 2 hours or 3 hours of music, that wheel just never stops. And that is one of the miracles of Mozart, which is unfathomable.
And it whizzes by the whole production. And it certainly, for me, it brings back very happy memories. John, how about for you?
Here they are, so this young couple, they're about to be married this evening, and they're trying to make sense of the first place they're going to live. And it delineates and differentiates his optimism and trust of the Count, who is their patron and their landlord, and Susanna's skepticism and mistrust of him. And that brings us directly to the whole question of sexual politics.
Following on from what you're saying about sexual politics, of course, this also depicts the rise of a new middle class. It seems to do that quite cleverly.
Yeah, I don't suppose they would have necessarily seen it as that then, but that's what it is. And the conflict, the basic political conflict embraces that problem, that the aristocracy is losing power to the rising professional classes and tradespeople, people who are gaining influence across the board through earning money and becoming independent. And this is like a microcosm, this little estate called Aguas Frescas, presided over by a count and countess rather than a king and queen, but nevertheless they have almost regal rights over their subjects. For whatever else they're doing, they are subjects. And at the same time, they are, in my opinion anyway, learning how to become middle class simply by imitating their betters. And that's a lot of the content of the opera is like that.
Imi, I wonder if we can move to some of the images that you can show us that pick up on that point.
Yeah, I was really thinking as John was speaking about this new professional class, the kind of rise of the bourgeoisie. I was immediately thinking about Chardin, one of the greatest painters of the 18th century. I'm showing you here a couple of his paintings. Here on the left, the water cistern, and on the right, the young schoolmistress. Chardin began his career as a great painter of still lives, and I think you can really see this in the water cistern. He painted it quite near the beginning of the 1730s, the period in his life when he started to add figures into his still life and genre paintings. And on the left of the painting, you can see this fascination he has with domestic objects, with the lighting, with the texture, the gleam on that copper bucket, the shine on that great hunk of meat hanging from the ceiling. In the centre of the painting is the water cistern of the title, and our maid is leaning over as she extracts water from this cistern. You can see the weight of the water as it enters the jug she's holding in the taut of her arm. Her cap is really covering her face, so we can't see her expression, but her back leads us through the open doorway to where another maid is standing with a child. And I'm sure you'll all recognise this trope from the kind of golden age of Dutch genre painting, paintings where we look through doorways and round corners even. We can see little glimpses of other scenes going on in the background. This is something that Chardin is playing with here. And yet there's a certain stillness to the kind of the soft lighting on these cobbles in this cellar. The bustle of downstairs life is almost hushed, I think, in this scene. This is a kind of scene that might be taking place downstairs in the household of one of these new bourgeois families in Paris at the time. And the second painting I want to talk with you about briefly is the young schoolmistress, that shows us a little vignette of life from one of these families, perhaps. Here we see a little boy, little girl, probably a little boy, but we're not quite sure. But little boys did wear little headdresses like this at the time, receiving a lesson from an older sister, or perhaps a cousin. Here she is teaching him his letters, we think. They both bend over a table with great concentration, looking down at a sheet, which Chardin has very carefully left slightly out of focus. There's a certain mystery to what they're looking at. But she points with this metal pointer, probably a knitting needle, and he points as well, imitating his older sister or cousin's gesture. His features are slightly out of focus, I think, but she is really noticeably looking into his face, checking that he's saying what she wants him to be saying, checking that he's understanding this lesson. Chardin was producing paintings of this kind of subject mainly for aristocratic collectors, but these paintings were also circulating through engravings, and people like the family seen here would have been the kinds of people who were collecting these engravings, using them to decorate their houses. Diderot, the great art critic and philosopher, described Chardin as the great magician for this magic that he could cast over moments of the everyday. Chardin was at once a genre painter and also a portrait painter, and I think that paintings like this certainly demonstrate his skill in that way. I think these issues really speak to some of the subjects we're discussing in line with Figaro, with regard to social class, this new kind of rising professional class, but also this sense of common humanity, of the magic of the everyday.
Dougie, I wonder if I can ask you there, just picking up on that point of, painting the everyday as high art. Do you feel, at least musically, that is Mozart writing high art here?
Wow, that's an extraordinarily good question. I mean, certainly his patronage, where he was writing for the aristocracy, who allegedly had great taste and had great discernment in the high arts. Whether that was true or not, I think is to be debated. But I think more important is the universality of Mozart's music, and that actually, in some ways, there's a simplicity to his music, and yet this unfathomable miracle about how it affects us as human beings. It's essentially about humanity. And in that sense, I think it's for the whole world, because he's one of the greatest human beings that ever lived. So I think it transcends high, just being put into a box of high art, but it's for the whole world. And all it does is one has to engage, and one has to learn a little bit about this language, and it will stay in your heart for the rest of your life.
John, I have a question for you. Just thinking as Imi was showing us those pictures, they're sort of vignettes of everyday life. But in this piece, we've got so many different scenes and so many different locations as well. How do you achieve that on the stage?
No problem, really. We did attempt to come up with, and I think we succeeded, a formula for it, which is based on the simple onion. I mean, if you peel an onion, as it were, and you get a layer, and then another layer, and then another layer. But of course, in our case, we've turned it inside out. We start right with the basic heart of the situation, which is the marriage of Figaro with Susanna and preparation for it. And then that scene is succeeded by a scene which is still very personal, only this time it's Susanna doing her job, because she is the personal maid of the Countess, and incidentally a very, very close friend. A close emotional tie exists between the two of them. And then there's Figaro, who is in charge of all the household servants, but basically he's on the side of the women, who are both anxious to subvert the Count's general promiscuity and desire to ignore his wife but take anything that's going from any other part of the estate. And that is another layer. Then we get to him. He is in the center of the next layer, which is when he is delivering the law, because he is the sovereign of that state. And then when everything is tangled and untangled 3 or 4 times, we get out into the freedom of the garden.
And of course, it's amazing to have that onion on a stage within a garden setting at Garsington. You can see.
Yeah, that's something I almost hate to do Figaro anywhere else. But then I said that about Fidelio, because both of them have fantastic garden scenes, and we were able to contrive to use the gardens both visually and actually.
If I can add just one thing, just my impression from these paintings is how the characters seem such real human being of flesh and blood. And I think that's also exactly the same in Mozart. It depends on the director, of course. And I'm not just buttering up John, but to work with John Cox, he creates real people of flesh and blood. And while we watch The Marriage of Figaro for these hours, we feel we are living the lives of Susanna and Figaro and the Count. They are real people. And I get the same impression when I look at these paintings.
So I just want to continue with the garden theme, Dougie, just at the very end, and we'll maybe come back to the clip a little later, but we see Susanna in the garden, and there's the darkness around her and the sense of the double-edgedness of what she's saying. Does that come through in the score as well?
Well, Mozart paints with music, and everything leads to the garden at the end of the opera. And maybe we'll talk about that a little later, but you know, it represents something. It's the house is dissolved, and society is kind of dissolved, and the garden opens up all sorts of possibilities, of erotic possibilities, disguise possibilities, and the smells are different. Our antennae are much more at one with nature, and I think Mozart paints this in the most incredible way, again with such simplicity in De Vieni, which Jenny France sings. I think it's one of the great Susanna performances. But in the orchestra, we have pizzicato, so plucking the string, and we have this airy woodwind commentary on Susanna's supposed seduction of 2 different people, in a sense. And it feels to me in the orchestration that nothing is on the ground, that we're lifted into a kind of dance in the sky, in the dusk sky. And I always feel that when we get to this moment in the score, you can smell the pines.
Imi, I'm sure you have some pictorial delights to show us around gardens, ambiguity and disguise.
Yeah, absolutely. Beaumarchais, De Ponte, Mozart, they're working in the second half of the 18th century, and what they're doing really grows out of a movement which starts with the work of artists like Watteau, a great painter, stage and set designer working in the late 17th and early 18th century. And I'm showing you here a painting of his called The Scale of Love, which is really one of my absolute favourites, painted in about 1717, 1718. This painting is one of a new kind of landscape painting that Watteau invents. A kind of painting called the Fête Galante, that is fantastical landscapes populated by aristocratic and theatrical couples gallivanting around, making music, making love, enjoying themselves in this sort of hedonistic Elysian fields of a paradise. And this painting takes a central couple here who are playing a musical duet together. Our lady is singing, she's being accompanied by her lover on the guitar. He wears a rather theatrical looking outfit, holding a guitar very similar to a number of instruments made in Paris at the time. And the title, The Scale of Love, is of course a real double entendre. In French, La Gamme d'Amour, this title is suggestive not only of the musical scale indicated above the couple by the sculpture of a bearded man, probably Pythagoras, who is credited with inventing the musical scale, but it also hints at promise, the scales of seduction, scales of lovemaking. This analogy between making music and making love is a long tradition in art history, reaching back to 16th century Venice, and Watteau is definitely thinking about these kinds of paintings when he makes a composition like this. But here our lovers are leaning together into an intimate music making. She looks to his fingers, she's looking at the way that his fingers are stroking the strings of his guitar, and he's leaning down reading the music which she's holding in her hand. You'll notice, of course, that there are other couples in the garden. There's a couple walking off into the distance, leaving, moving further into the paradise. And there's another couple seated on the ground to their right, and a woman with a child in her lap. And this is all very ambiguous. It's unclear whether these are all supposed to be different couples, different people, or whether these figures also represent our first central couple. We're seeing different phases in their relationship, and this child perhaps being symbolic of the fruits of love. It's all very mysterious, and yet Watteau paints it in this gorgeously colourful and rich landscape. Those textures of the fabric, carefully composed pinks and reds and russets, a real contrast to the lush green of the trees above. These paintings like this, of course, really speak to an 18th century fascination with nature and with gardens. And I'm really delighted to have a friend and old colleague of mine, Dr. Caroline McCaffrey-Howarth, incoming curator of 17th and 18th century decorative arts at the Victoria and Albert Museum, joining us now. Hi, Caroline.
Hi, Imogen. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. Caroline, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the significance of nature in gardens in the long 18th century.
Mm-hmm. I think gardens in the 18th century, especially in France, were really a perfect manifestation of the age of enlightenment. So the shift to a great interest in science, rational thought, morality, and gardens were really a place of nature. They were uncorrupted by society. They were pure. There was an idea of them being rustic, of pure virtues, of honest country living folk living and working with the land in nature. And gardens really play into this kind of increasing interest in this, especially in the Rococo era with someone like Watteau and the Fête Galante that you just mentioned, Imogen. And then also, as we move into the sort of more romantic notions of the later 18th century and philosophers like Rousseau examining nature as a place where there aren't social classes, where anyone can be anything, where spectacle can happen, where theatricality can happen, and really a place where the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie can escape, can find freedom in the garden space. And this even went as far as to the monarchy themselves. So there's a really lovely story and a fantastic image as well, actually, of King Louis XV hosting a masquerade ball at Versailles in 1745. And it later becomes known as the Yew Tree Ball, because the king comes dressed up with all of his entourage as a set of topiary. So they're all dressed with branches and foliage, and they bring nature indoors in this very particular way. And actually it's the ball where he meets Madame de Pompadour, who becomes his most trusted, well-known, famous mistress, royal mistress at this stage as well. So there's a real sense of frivolity with gardens, of giving the bourgeoisie, but also the aristocracy, something to play with, I think.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, what a picture. It's quite Macbeth, really, in some ways. I guess these ideas, presumably, they work their way into people's everyday lives then.
Absolutely. Yes, there was really a sense of bringing the outside in, and this being very important. And what I really loved about John's production with Le Figaro is the fact that you can see this sort of blur between the interior and the exterior, always kind of catching sight of the garden as it leads you up to this most anticipated moment of the final finish of the opera, which was fantastic. But quite often they were using art, and decorative arts in particular, as a way of bringing the outside in. So there's a really lovely story of Madame de Pompadour arranging vases upon vases upon vases of porcelain Sèvres flowers, so very delicate porcelain flowers arranged in these vases, and she adds perfume to each one so that it smells like the flower that it is, and she arranges it all for the king, for Louis XV. And Richelieu writes that when he comes and he sees this array of flowers, he tries to lift up the bouquets because they smell so real and so natural, but of course they're porcelain, they're not real. So there's this sense of artifice in there as well, which is really quite interesting.
That sounds also rather erotic to me. There's a sort of certain hedonism about gardens in this time, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely. Gardens, I think, are a sort of place of illicit love, really. And we see this coming across in art. What jumps to my mind straight away is an example like Fragonard's The Swing painting, now at the Wallace Collection in London, which many of you may know, which shows this wonderfully dressed lady swinging in the garden, and as she swings, her shoe just flips off into the air, and below in the bushes, ready to catch it, is her lover. But of course, he's also angled, gesturing to her, looking straight up into her skirts. And there's this real sense of sexual lust, of a secret as well. And what we have in the background is this beautiful sculpture based on Etienne Maurice Falconet's L'amour menaçant, which is this sort of peeping Cupid, who telling you, to not say anything at all, to keep it secret, keep it hushed. So there is this sort of dangerous liaison aspect of the garden as well.
It sounds also that gardens, they potentially have a lot of rather dangerous connotations as far as social mixing goes as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially at this time, because anyone could be anyone in the garden, and it was a sort of place where standard norms and traditions of society, of the monarchy, of the aristocracy and the ruling class sort of disintegrate. And that really ties into a lot of Enlightenment philosophy at this time. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, writes in The Social Contract about the fact that he questions kind of the king's divine right to rule. And instead, he's arguing that there's a real importance of the will of the people. And the minute that you get the will of the people together in a space where they have the potential to become equals, like a garden, then there is this sense of freedom of thought, but also freedom of political power and social power. And really, actually, that's what we see happening in France as we kind of progress to the revolution, actually coming and happening in that way. And I think with Rousseau and with gardens, they become a place where everyone is equal. So there's a sort of a field of equalizing politics. And actually, I think it plays across really well in this opera, especially towards the end, what we have with everyone playing these different roles and different identities and characters in the actual space of garden, which was a pretty revolutionary thing, I think, at the time.
That has teed us up perfectly to watch the clip of Susanna singing in the garden towards the end of Figaro in John Cox's production with Dougie Boyd conducting.
splende in ciel notturna face, finché l'aria ancor bruna il mondo tace. Qui mormora il ruscello, qui scherza l'aura, che col dolce sussurro il cor ristaura. Qui ridono i fioretti e l'erba è fresca, ai piaceri d'amor qui tutto adesca. Vieni, ben mio, tra queste piante oscose.
So that was the amazing Jenny France singing the role of Susanna in Garsington Opera's production of The Marriage of Figaro. And just before we leave you, John, I just wanted to say, whether it's your production or Dougie's conducting or Jenny's performance or Mozart himself, these characters seem indelible. They seem truly human.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. They are, and you could go through Mozart's brief life and take so many examples of his behavior, apart from anything else, which could not be more human if they tried. Just try reading a few of the more obscene letters, fantastically human. And, before we all get carried away on a cloud of 18th century perfume and flowers and everything, Mozart knew a little bit about the smell of the stable and places like that. Other parts of the Aguas Frescas house and palace there, the whole of that is represented, or should be, and that gives you a sense of the human life. All human life is there.
Well, common humanity, I mean, that feels as good as any point to end this week's episode on. So I would just like to thank very much our three guests. Thank you for joining us, and stay safe. And Imi, do you want to share what we've got coming up next week?
Next week, we're going to be looking at Smetana's Barter Bride. So join us again for another conversation about maybe nationalism, dancing, circuses. All will be revealed.
So let's just leave you again with the final strains of De Vieni, sung by Jennifer France at Garsington Opera in John Cox's production of The Marriage of Figaro. Bye.